2 Timothy is before us this morning. I purchased this book a couple of weeks ago for £1 in the Waterstones sale, no less. Its author, Simon Sebag Montefiore, selects letters written over the centuries that he believes have changed the world. Letters from the likes of Elizabeth I, Ramesses the Great, Emmeline Pankhurst, Nelson Mandela, Joseph Stalin, and even some unknown people who were found in extraordinary circumstances. And of these people and these letters, he writes this: "These letters are essential reading. They enlighten our past, enrich the way we live now, and illuminate tomorrow." Indeed. Of course, as Bible folk, I trust we know just how essential and world-changing are the letters which are contained in this book, God's Word, the Bible, and in our New Testament. And a letter, such as the one we have before us this morning, to Timothy. Now, sadly, Montefiore's book contains no great letters from the Bible, not even a small extract from one of the Apostle Paul's great letters that we are privileged today to have and to be able to read, to enlighten, enrich, and illuminate us, because that is what these letters do. In this book, written in history, Montefiore has a final section of letters titled Goodbye. And in that section he includes a letter from Winston Churchill, which Churchill wrote to his wife, Clementine, during the First World War. He composed it in November 1915, just after he'd resigned his position in the Admiralty, and he was awaiting deployment to the trenches in northern France as a lieutenant colonel in the army. And the letter, which was to be opened in the event of my death, reads as follows: "I am anxious that you should get hold of all my papers, especially those which refer to my Admiralty administration. I have appointed you my sole literary executor. There is no hurry, but someday I should like the truth to be known. Randolph will carry on the lamp. Do not grieve for me too much. I am a spirit confident of my rights. Death is only an incident and not the most important which happens to us in this state of being. On the whole, especially since I met you, my darling one, I have been happy, and you have taught me how noble a woman's heart can be. If there is anywhere else, I shall be on the lookout for you. Meanwhile, look forward, feel free, rejoice in life, cherish the children, guard my memory. God bless you, goodbye. W." This letter, brief, poignant, was a farewell communication, and it put me in mind very much of 2 Timothy. This most urgent letter that Paul wrote to this young man. And as I say, Montefiore would have done well to have included some of what is written here. For Paul has a great purpose in writing, which I hope we shall discover together. We're going to start a new series on this letter. And as Paul is writing this second letter to Timothy, he is awaiting his forthcoming trial. He's very aware that time is short, and that his execution is imminent. This letter then to Timothy, to be opened and read in the certainty of my death. That's how we should treat this letter. And as John Stott comments, being written under the shadow of his own death, what we have in this letter is, he writes, both an intensely personal communication to his young friend Timothy, but also, most consciously, Paul's last will and testament to the church. This morning, then, we're going to aim to become better acquainted with 2 Timothy, with just a brief introduction to the letter. And we're going to be introduced to 2 Timothy by these 3 headings. We're going to look at the sender, the passionate prisoner Paul. We're going to look at the receiver, the trustworthy, timid Timothy. And we're going to look at the content, the growth of the great gospel. The Bishop of Durham, at the turn of the last century, was the evangelical theologian Handley Moule. And he once confessed that he found it difficult to read Paul's second letter to Timothy without finding something like a mist gathering in my eyes. And he writes that with good reason, because when you consider the writer and his earthly situation, you cannot help but see how utterly moving this letter is, how completely human this letter is. It moves us, perhaps to tears. Imagine just for a moment the Apostle Paul. He's now fairly old, and he's languishing in some dark, dank dungeon. He's in Rome again. But this time there is no escape from death. His job is done. I have finished the race, he writes. And now he wants to make provision for the work to go on. The work of the gospel is to proceed. And Paul is especially concerned about how the good news of Jesus Christ will be transmitted to the next generation. And so he sends Timothy, this young man, this most solemn communication. He gives Timothy a charge to preserve what he's received, and whatever the cost is to be, to pass it on to others who will be faithful in preaching it, in teaching it, and in training others. So we want to grasp what this letter's message is, and I want to help us prepare to feel its full impact. We need to understand a little about the background against when it was written and why. So we'll do that now with these headings. The first is this. We'll look at the sender briefly. That's the passionate prisoner Paul. Now, the genuineness of this letter to Timothy as being by the hand of Paul was generally accepted for many centuries, until the early 19th century, that is. And then scholars began to become skeptical, as they did in many areas to do with biblical truth. Now, I'm not going to spend any time this morning driving home the reasons why we do believe it is by Paul himself. Some people have a difficulty with the events here being matched up with the events of Acts. It's clear that Paul is in prison towards the end of Acts, but not in this situation. Clearly, I think the book of Acts finishes before these events are taking place. You can't mirror 2 Timothy with events in Acts, it would appear. Paul is in prison again here, so we shouldn't be too troubled about it. What I will say is this. Paul's personality runs throughout this letter. One commentator has pointed out the human heart is in it everywhere, and fakers or fabricators, certainly of that age, did not well understand the heart. What he's saying is you couldn't fake Paul if you tried. It's full of his heart. And Paul's heart is truly on display in 2 Timothy. And as its writer, he describes himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ. That's not an unusual description that he gives in verse 1. But in verse 8, he also refers to himself as the Lord's prisoner in a specific way. And it's being a prisoner and the prison setting that is permeating Paul's thinking as he writes to Timothy. Now, as I've just said, this was Paul's second imprisonment in Rome. The first one, which we do read about in Acts, seems to be one of comparative freedom. Paul then was under guard, but in a hired house, and he seemed to be quite free in what he was able to do. Now, Paul then anticipated his release, and it appears he was released as he expected, and he set out again on his missionary journeys. Perhaps, as he expresses in the book of Romans in chapter 15, he had an intention to go west, and he may well have ended up in Spain, evangelizing Spain. Do you know, there are some people who think he came further and further west, even that he came to Britain. We've no evidence of that at all. But that's where he went after he was released, west it would appear, on further missionary journeys. But here's the point. He has been arrested again, somewhere, at some time. And this time, his circumstances are very different. He's in a much darker place. The New Testament scholar Hendrickson, says it was likely that he was in a dismal underground dungeon with just a hole in the ceiling for light and air. Highly likely. We know, don't we, from chapter 1, verse 17, of the man Onesiphorus. He had discovered Paul's whereabouts in Rome, but only after it appears a diligent search for him. He wasn't now in a prominent home, he was in a forgotten place. And from the preceding verses, we discover that Paul is now, unlike before, bound. He's chained. He says in chapter 2, verse 9, that he is being chained like a criminal. That's his own description. And in chapter 4, verses 9 to 13, Paul talks about his circumstances. And it's safe, I think, to assume from those verses, 9 to 13 in chapter 4, that Paul is experiencing extreme loneliness, real boredom, and real extreme cold. In verses 16 and 17 of chapter 4, Paul talks there about his preliminary hearing, which has already happened, and now he's waiting his full trial. And from that preliminary hearing, if you look at chapter 4, verses 6, 7 and 8, it appears that Paul is quite convinced that he will not come out of this alive. Paul knows what is awaiting him. This trial will not acquit him now. So here's Paul, the prisoner. Now here's a question, a simple question to ask. Why was Paul in this place? Why was Paul in this position? And the answer is equally simple. We know it. Paul was passionate about something. He was passionate about Christ. He was passionate about the gospel of Jesus Christ. He was, as verse 1 of chapter 1 declares, an apostle of Christ Jesus by the will of God. And this, which he declares in verse 11 of chapter 1, was to be gospel preaching, Christ-revealing work. That's what he was passionate about. And that's why he's in prison. There was a persecution going on. The Emperor Nero, AD 64, we think, is currently in full swing in his persecution against the Christian church. He does not understand the Christian church and its motives. And Paul knows that death is the only way he will now escape and find freedom. And so, even though he's opposed by the enemies of Christ, Paul is still saying that he is an appointed herald, apostle, and teacher. It has not dimmed his desire for the gospel and its importance. In fact, in chapter 1, verse 12, he says to Timothy, that or this is why I am suffering. Paul isn't sitting there going, why is this happening? What's going on? Paul is clear. This is why I'm suffering. It's for Christ's sake. It's the gospel. Now, there's a simple observation that I think follows from this. Questions I can ask us all as we look at this in the life of Paul. Are we doing all that we can, all that we should, for the gospel's sake today? Wherever we are now, in whatever state or circumstances we find ourselves to be in, are we prepared to face whatever opposition there is to the message of Christ as we encounter it ourselves? For Paul, even prison at the close of his life, gospel work must go on by prayer, by encouragement, by teaching, by training, by passing on the truth. It must not diminish, dependent on what's happening to him. That work was still ongoing. In that sense, it was never finished. He would be finished. The work would go on. How? In others. In those to come. Even in you and me. And though he was physically chained, he was not prepared to believe that the gospel could be held back. It could not be chained. It was not restricted. Humanly speaking, he could do nothing no longer. You may say, humanly speaking, I can do little today. Really? Are you in the same position and predicament as Paul? Really? He did the work. How about us with our extensive freedom? Are we doing the gospel work that we should? So that's the sender of this letter, the passionate prisoner Paul. Here's the receiver of the letter. I'm calling him the trustworthy, timid Timothy. Why do we say that? We'll have a look. Now, for 15 years, since he had first been recruited in the hometown of Lystra, Timothy had been Paul's faithful missionary companion. Now, he travelled with him throughout most of his second and his third missionary journeys. He'd been a trusted delegate on several special missions. He'd accompanied Paul to Jerusalem. He may have been with Paul on the perilous first journey to Rome. He was certainly in Rome during Paul's first imprisonment, because when the Apostle Paul writes from there, he added Timothy's name to those prison-written letters like Philemon and the Philippian and Colossian church letters. And Paul, therefore, has a strong connection, a strong affection for Timothy. In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 17, he says, "He is my son whom I love." He'd grown to trust Timothy as a fellow worker in the gospel. In fact, because of Timothy's genuine concern for the welfare of other believers and for the welfare of other churches, and because of the loyalty with which he had served with Paul in gospel work, Paul would go so far in Philippians 2 verse 20 to say, "I have no one else like him." And he added in verse 22, "Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel." It's not surprising, therefore, is it, when that first imprisonment in Rome was over, that Paul felt he could leave Timothy in Ephesus at one time as the leader of that church. But now, times have changed. It appears harder, heavier, shall we say, work, even greater burdens were about to fall on Timothy's shoulders. Because Paul was about to die. And preserving, teaching the gospel would now be his in greater measure. But on the surface, Timothy may well seem to be someone who was well equipped for this, we might say. But when you dig beneath the surface, we might find that there are things that would say that he was perhaps not ready to assume the weighty responsibilities of leadership in the church. Now, why? Well, firstly, Timothy was still comparatively young. When you talk about young and old in Bible times, they're not the same terms perhaps as we would use today, but he appears to be comparatively young. Paul, you may recall, had urged him in his first letter, 1 Timothy, not to let anyone look down on you because you are young. And in this second letter, in chapter 2, verse 22, which is a year or two later, we believe, he warns him to flee the evil desires of youth. He's still comparatively young. Now, we don't know Timothy's precise age. He may have been 20 or so when Paul enrolled him into missionary work. He might be in his late 20s. We don't know. But certainly he is still at a fairly young age, we might say, for such church leadership to be committed to him. Also, Timothy, it appears, was perhaps a little prone to certain weaknesses or maybe illnesses, perhaps. In the first letter to Timothy, Paul had referred to Timothy's frequent weaknesses or ailments without specifying again what they were. He went on to recommend for Timothy's stomach's sake that he should give up drinking only water and try a little wine as well. Quite what we're talking about, we don't know, but he appears to have suffered in some way with that weakness. In addition, it appears perhaps that Timothy may have been something of, I say, a timid temperament. He may naturally have been quite a shy individual. If he'd lived now, we might describe him as an introvert, perhaps. And he may have been someone that allowed others to intimidate him. Listen to this. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul intriguingly writes, "When Timothy comes, see to it that he has nothing to fear while he is with you. For he is carrying on the work of the Lord, just as I am. No one then should treat him with contempt." Paul's preparing the way for perhaps, a shy man to come and take this important work. Several times in this second letter, Timothy is urged to take his share of suffering and not to be afraid or ashamed. And Paul reminds him in chapter 1, verse 7, that the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid. It seems that Paul is saying you need to overcome this timidity. maybe. Paul is concerned for Timothy, clearly then, and rightly so. And he seems to be warning him. He obviously felt these warnings, these words were necessary for Timothy's character, for Timothy's sake. He clearly knew Timothy very well, didn't he, as his son. One commentator, putting all this together, says, maybe Timothy was someone who was more disposed to lean rather than to lead. Do you know something of that? Oh yes, you love the gospel and you want to be involved, but you'd rather lean on someone else than step out and lead yourself. That's a very common trait in many people of every age, to be leaners rather than leaders. Now, we need all types of people, but Timothy needed to step up. I think this is the important point. There need to be less leaning and more leading. So here is Timothy, young in years for sure, possibly frail in physique, maybe, also possibly retiring in nature. But nevertheless, someone who's called to challenging responsibilities in the Church of God. In his play Twelfth Night, Shakespeare writes that some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. The latter may be the case for this young man Timothy. Is he unique? No. Moses would rather not have been the man he was, called to be by God. Jeremiah and others, a host of other biblical characters, felt reluctance to step forward when God called them to. Yet they did. Timothy could have been extremely reluctant, perhaps, to accept such responsibility. Here's the question. Is this the very case? Is this true? Maybe for someone here listening this morning. Are you in a similar position? You may be young, feeling inadequate, weak, shy, and yet God may be calling you perhaps to greater responsibility than you have now, even to leadership in the Church of God. Now, if that's the case, then maybe this letter to Timothy has a special word, maybe even a direct message for all the timid Timothys of today. Why not listen carefully then in the coming weeks as we explore this letter? Finally, we come to the content of this letter. We're going to explore this, of course, in the weeks ahead, but here's a summary. The growing of the great gospel. The Apostle Paul's own gospel career was virtually over. His preoccupation in writing to Timothy now was with the gospel and with the deposit of truth which had been revealed and committed to him by God for over 30 years. Paul had faithfully preached the good news. He planted churches. He defended the truth. He consolidated the work. And as he says in chapter 4, verse 7, he had fought the fight. He had finished the race. He had kept the faith. All that awaited him now was the victor's crown. But what would happen to the gospel when he was dead and gone? Nero was determined to destroy it as he misunderstood the nature of the church. And on top of this, heresy, it would appear, was breaking out all around. It was on the increase. Apostasy from Paul's teaching in some areas was rife. Now, humanly speaking, the church may have seemed at this point on the verge of annihilation. Who then would do battle for the truth? That was the question that dominated Paul's mind as he lay in chains. And it's this continuing growth of the gospel that he seeks to address in this letter. In the first letter to Timothy, he pleaded with Timothy to keep safe what had been given to him, to guard what had been entrusted to him. 1 Timothy 6:20. But since then, the situation had worsened. And so his appeal now is even more urgent. And Paul is reminding Timothy that this precious gospel was now being committed to him. Yes, him. It's now his turn to assume responsibility, to preach, to teach, to defend against attack, and to ensure the accurate transmission of the gospel to those who would come after even him. And in each chapter, there are just 4 in this letter, Paul returns to this same basic concern. We can summarize the message of this letter, and we will, by this 4-fold responsibility. Chapter 1, guard the gospel, says Paul to Timothy. Chapter 2, suffer for the gospel, says Paul to Timothy. Chapter 3, continue in the gospel, says Paul to Timothy. Chapter 4, proclaim the gospel. We will look at these in more detail as we work through this letter. But we end again today with this simple question. Does the church of our day need to heed the message of the second letter of Paul to Timothy? Does it? Yes. Most certainly it does. Maybe all around us, we too can see Christians and churches relaxing their grip on the gospel. They're in danger of dropping it, of letting it fall from their hands. What about us? Perhaps there is a new generation of young Timothys, which is exactly what we need right now, ready to receive, to grip, to hold, to proclaim, to continue, to suffer, and to guard the gospel. A new generation of those who will take this deposit and will be determined to proclaim it and to suffer for it as they seek to pass it on in a pure way. My prayer, our prayer, I trust, is that just such a generation today will be hearing this message then, and will be ready to rise up for his praise and glory. Amen. So you know where we're going. You can read 2 Timothy at your leisure, and we shall look at it in future weeks together. Our hymn to close